Let's start with relational databases. Here's a portion of a database schema. You can see that it's pretty complicated and not very flat. Now let me tell you a story. In the dark ages of computing, before we had relational databases, we used codicil, record and link databases. These didn't have a query language, so each application had to walk the records and links on its own to find what it needed. You can imagine what happened every time you wanted to change a record or a link. Programmers had to check and possibly update every database application so that it could find its way in the new schema. These days we use query languages like SQL to flatten the data before we hand it over to the application. Flattening encapsulates and hides the true complexity of the schema, making database programming much easier. Flattening also presents the results in simple tables that are easy to process using loops and cursors. And flattening makes it easy to add new fields, either to the base data structures or to the returned results, without impacting the other applications using the data. So data flattening is not that new an idea, and in fact, it's an important reason why modern databases work so well. RSSBus applies these same flattening principles to web services. Each simple service is a bit like a SQL statement, presenting a view of data that's useful to a particular kind of service consumer. This group can extend their service anytime with more fields. If another group needs a different view of the data, just generate another simple service for them. Simple services are easy to make, and adding more services is a lot safer than trying to create one big service that exposes too much structure detail to the clients. While we're on the topic of exposing too much structure, let me say a bit about remote procedure calls and SOAP. Most SOAP interactions are based on the remote procedure call. Procedures have been around since the early days of compilers, when the first procedure library provided math routines for the formula translator called Fortran. This worked out great, but we need to remember two conditions that made early procedure calls work. The mathematics data types and functions that they implemented were widely understood and stable, and the procedure library was linked right into the application image. Enterprise remote procedure calls violate these two conditions. The data types and functions are business-based, so views of them can vary over time from business unit to business unit. Secondly, the called procedure is not linked directly into the caller's application, so the calling and serving programs can change independently, usually with very bad results. The impact of violating these conditions becomes obvious when you try to support your second caller. Now you have to get 3 people to agree on what a customer object is, and before long, you'll have governance committees trying to sort out all the objects and services. This process is so expensive that you'll want to entomb these agreements in a service registry to discourage any further thoughts of change. Well, this whole scenario is highly unlikely to work out in any real enterprise. Business units won't agree on common definitions, and even if they did, the real world changes a lot faster than committee-driven code. The sad thing is that we've learned these same lessons several times in the past with the rise and fall of Corba, RMI, and J2EE. SOAP is just the latest till at the RPC windmill, but this time with XML encoding, which really doesn't do a thing to help with the root problem. And speaking of angle brackets, here's a little snippet of a SOAP response. This response format was designed by programmers for programmers and is clearly way too complicated for any business user or popular desktop client. So thinking about the simple services principles, we realize that SOAP makes little or no effort to flatten, it encourages standardization rather than flexibility, and it delivers results that are only useful to programmers. So SOAP doesn't score very well on the simplicity scale. To be fair, SOAP and RPC calls do work well when you honor the procedure call conditions presented at the beginning of this section. These conditions are typically true for infrastructure services like printing and authentication, and also for transactions that transmit account numbers instead of entire domain objects. Okay, let's get back on track with simple services and finish with a quick look at a real-world example that one of our customers built.